you for that introduction. Okay, re-energized. Thank you for coming back. I really enjoyed having an opportunity to speak with you after the first session. So we know each other a little bit better now, right? I know that you've come from all over. I know that some of your discipline backgrounds include the humanities, literature, and film studies. There are some psychologists here. There are some people who study narrative and intergenerational memory. So we all come to this room with different backgrounds that are incredibly important. I'm hoping that we can run every lecture the way the first one went, which is I'll stop a little bit early. We can find some passages that I've bolded that are on the slides that we can unpack together, all bringing our different angles, and then we can start thinking a little bit about the discussion questions. That format is related to our assessment. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin the formal remarks. After every day, we'll have an assessment. I want you to think a little bit about whether our model for today works. We don't have a tutorial planned, so what we'll ask you to do is respond to the assessment after we break for the day. Dr. Shipra Tolia has sent you or will send you these exact questions that are on the screen. Every day's format will be the same. You'll choose one from part A, a passage that we go over during the lecture. Could be any one. So these are all the passages, for example, that we talked about in the first lecture. And I'm just going to add on. There will be sets of passages from lecture 3 and lecture 2. And so that's section A. And then part B is choose one of our discussion questions. So one from A, one from B. Part A will look at your ability to focus on word choice like we did, right? Voice or unwitting or action. And then part 2, the theoretical, the discussion questions are more open-ended. It's like, what's at stake, right? What's your philosophy? So since we don't have a tutorial for today, we're asking you to do this assessment overnight. You have the questions in front of you. And then when we get back tomorrow for our tutorial, you can let us know if you prefer to have that time to write or if you find that you'd rather have that time to generate more ideas so you go home in the evening to write. So that will be up to you. But for tonight, please try this assessment out and let us know if you have any questions. But we are all like trying to teach to the assessment. So I'm hoping you have everything that you need in order to have some good ideas. And again, back to our comment about non-mastery, we're not looking for a correct answer. There is not one correct answer. There are many possible answers as long as you ground your thinking in the language of the passage and the lesson for the day. Are there any questions there? Feel confident about the road ahead and comfortable, I hope? You're in good hands. More volume? Does the essay have a word limit? I think I'm going to ask a coordinator. Should we put a limit on? Otherwise, you're going to write all night and then you're going to be sad. But I was thinking for the essays, something like a 5-paragraph theme. I know that's very basic, but that's a way to control your ideas. So thesis, you know, like an arguable thing, claim, and then 3 paragraphs supporting that, and then some concluding remarks. Is that helpful? And then the explication, maybe 6 sentences. I'm looking at the repetition of the word voice. You see voice here, here, here. This is what it means. This is why it's important. Something like that. So don't spend all night on it. Do you want to put on a limit? Okay, just right. All right, so thank you for that, indulging me in that bit of housekeeping. Okay, we're ready to go again. For my narrative medicine people, for my medical ethics people, we are thinking about how trauma studies converges with a discourse of narrative medicine. And I'm going to argue that at that point of convergence is a focus on the ethical witness, the listener, who will take on with respect the story of someone who is suffering. So I came of age intellectually, as some of you now know, at Emory University from 1998 to 2003, more than 20 years ago now. It's a very fruitful time for thinking about the relevance of trauma theory with experts from a variety of fields: psychology, psychoanalysis, psychiatry, film studies, literary studies, history, sociology, and comparative literature, to name only a few. And I shared with a few of you my experience in the psychoanalytic studies program, where I got together with people from the scientists who were very strong in one aspect, but when I asked why we weren't doing close reading and interpretation, they said that's not what we do in our field, right? And likewise, I had to learn a value for like mastering certain kinds of knowledge. So think about trauma studies as a coming together of all of these different ways of thinking from various disciplines. Grounded in the practice of close reading, a skill we will be working out together during the seminar, the passages, for example, in your assessments. Trauma theory has at the heart the belief of understanding that when a text seems to fail at representing, if it leaves gaps or repetitions, if it stumbles, if it introduces catachresis, that is, images or ideas that do not exist in the world, that is where we see a truth, paradoxically, emerge. And it is in this very failure to represent we see a successful articulation of an unresolved traumatic experience. My second book is on representations of falling after 9/11, a defense of failed texts written in the wake of 9/11. Jonathan Safran Foer's Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, Don DeLillo's Falling Man, they were at the heart of my defense. Both books were criticized heavily by reviewers for their failure to do justice to the events of 9/11. Foer was criticized for his annoying protagonist, Oscar. DeLillo was criticized for his style. His book was called spindly and dismissed as unsatisfying. At the same time, I was thinking about trauma representation in terms of a structure of history. The idea that it is difficult to represent a single event because it came too soon for anyone to be prepared fully to capture it. The 9/11 terrorist attacks is an example. I looked at how representation of that event failed time and again. My first book, on the other hand, is on American author Philip Roth, how his later works represented the founding American history as traumatic in the sense that it came too soon. So another event-based book. That a nation built on the belief of equality has never been able to live up to its ideals, and that this failure has led to disruptions in our very social fabric seen today. Most notably, we can see this in our current political moment in the US, I will speak about anyway, a moment Philip Roth predicted in his book that gave me nightmares, Plot Against America from 2005. Again, this reading has to do with a structure of time. I'm going to work against that in a little bit, but say, like, as our starting point, we have an interest in how to represent time of an event unexpected, such as the Revolutionary War or the results of a democratic election that result in autocracy. However, with my third book, focused on convergences between trauma studies and narrative medicine, because I was working on illness, I began to understand trauma not simply in terms of a single event, not fully witnessed, but rather in terms of an ongoing crisis that everyone knows about, that everyone could prepare for, but which is nevertheless ignored. My third book considers HIV/AIDS representation during a time, such as the 1980s in the US, when national leaders refused to acknowledge a crisis because the people suffering, the LGBTQ community, and intravenous drug users existed on the margins of society. So I give you this kind of book report as a way to show how my thinking about trauma has shifted from a problem with representing an historical moment that was unprepared for, to a problem of representing a traumatic experience that is in the open, that everyone has access to information about. And for me, the sense of the trauma there is on an unwillingness to engage with people who are suffering. So we've pivoted from an event without a witness to people without a witness, but people who can be seen every day in a very bright light. So what do we do with that? Both my work on HIV/AIDS representation and on Philip Roth's representation of illness, in particular his women with cancer, and his 1990 patrimony, led me to another critical mode of reading that is broadly described as narrative medicine, a field largely championed by the medical community, which argues that in literature of illness, we see lessons for how to treat and respond to the sick. It is the medical community, interestingly, that has allowed literary critics to value literature in a new way, for the way it connects the reader to the communities who occupy hospitals, hospice care, and clinics. Rita Sharon's book from 2006, one that appeared 20 years after the emergence of trauma theory, centralizing the all-important ethical witness that we talked about last time, Can't You See?, argues that physicians need to approach patients with narrative awareness. That is, she argues that patients offer stories of illness in the same way a fiction writer would, or a creative essayist, and it is in those stories that healthcare workers can form an ethical relationship with people that they treat. I heard someone talk about the importance of this in the midst of a focus on insurance policy, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. That is, how do you get outside of the administrative program of just checking off boxes so you can make the bureaucrats happy, right? Like Rita Sharon is saying, listen to the patients for what they tell you about how they feel. In a section entitled Ethicality, Rita Sharon writes, both bioethicists and literary scholars write about narrative ethics, scaling the disciplinary boundaries between healthcare and literary studies to contemplate the obligations incurred in narrative acts, the ethical vision afforded by stories, and the ethicality of the very acts of writing and reading. I love this a lot. Here is a medical practitioner who says, English majors, people who know about narrative and stories, you are on to something. You have a way that we can use to treat the sick. Sharon cites Adam Zachary Newton's work, Narrative Ethics, as an example of ethical criticism, in which she says, the voice of the ethical critic gently but gravely reminds us that reading and writing are high-stakes actions with consequences not only in books, but in ordinary lives. That is, high-stakes actions that relate to our reading of books, but those skills can be transferred to our relation with other people, ordinary lives. She cites the heart of Newton's arguments. One of them is, storytelling lays claims upon all its participants, those circumscribed within the narrative, as well as those witnesses and ethical co-creators from without, its readers. For me, the key words here are witness and ethics. We've been talking about those all morning. Two terms that take the center stage in trauma studies I had immersed myself in since 1995. Terms I had later come to realize emerged out of response to the Holocaust, the first borrowed from the court of law, the very court that strained under the burden of trying Nazi war criminals, the second borrowed from a post-World War II philosophy with a new investment in how we treat each other. Emmanuel Levinas is that theorist who famously said, when faced with an other, that we have two choices, to speak or to kill. Jeffrey Hartman later suggested to me that this is not a metaphor, especially if we think about the ethical moment between a Jewish person in a concentration camp, and the Nazi officer tasked with sending her to her death. However, the life did not go on until I turned one page and another in Sharon's book. There it is on page 57. After walking through readings of J. Hillis Miller and Martha Nussbaum, Jeffrey Hartman, who focuses on the teller's duties and the reader's response to the telling, the name I had studied with trauma theorist and as a dutiful student, Kathy Caruth. Here is Sharon. So this is a passage I found in a book about narrative medicine. Different forms of telling, romantic poetry, modernist fiction, trauma testimony, and clinical interviewing combine the need to know what the duties incurred by virtue of knowing. The trauma studies scholar Kathy Caruth observes that the shock of traumatic sight reveals at the heart of human subjectivity not so much as an epistemological, but rather what can be defined as an ethical relation. There is our reference to ethical relation and ethics. It's a narrative medicine practitioner who says, let's look to trauma theory to understand what it means to engage via the ethical relation. The key word there is trauma, a moment that cannot be prepared for. And then the second is ethics, as in ethical relation. How do we take in and process the story of those who have experienced something, quote, outside the range of human experience? That was the first definition in the DSM manual we talked about earlier. That is the question at the heart of trauma. It is also, according to Sharon and Ann Juracek, author of the 2012 Illness as Narrative, at the heart of narrative medicine. How do we take in and process the stories of the ill? Just like that, one sentence. It is there and it is gone. The awareness of the significance of the work of trauma studies to this new field called narrative medicine. What brings them together is a sense of ethics, the ethical relation, more important even than epistemology or how we come to know things. But ethics, how we process the shock of traumatic sight at the heart of human subjectivity. The unexpected citing of Caruth's theory of trauma in Sharon's book made me question whether I had been reading trauma theory wrong all along. All these years, as a modernist critic and a postmodern thinker, I had been looking at the structure of narratives for their inability to represent linear time. I had been thinking all these years about the key part of the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder, a response, sometimes delayed, to an overwhelming event or events, which takes the form of repeated intrusive hallucinations, dreams, thoughts, or behaviors stemming from the event, along with the numbing that may have begun during or after the experience. So here it's about one experience in time. I had been focusing on this aspect of being outside of linear time, thinking about the aspects such as delayed response, as well as repeated hallucinations and dreams that tried to take the traumatized back to the moment that had not been fully processed in the first place. That is one way of reading Freud's book 2 of Beyond the Pleasure Principle. This is underscored when Caruth writes, so this is Caruth again defining trauma from the perspective of a single event. The pathology cannot be defined either by the event itself, which may or may not, may or may not be catastrophic and may not traumatize everyone equally, nor can it be defined in terms of a distortion of the event. The pathology consists rather solely in the structure of the experience of reception. The event is not assimilated or experienced fully at the time, but only belatedly in its repeated possession of the one who experienced it. This is commonly used as like the exemplary definition of traumatic experience, and like for good reason, right? This checks all the boxes. We talked about how one event is not experienced equally among others. We talked about an event that is not assimilated or experienced fully at the time, and thus leading to the unwitting repetition. So I could see why people, when they think about trauma studies, are thinking about what it means to process a single event or to struggle with it. Here, the focus of the theory appears to be on a distorted sense of time in the structure of the experience as belated. It comes both too soon and too late, resulting in a sense for the survivor of being outside of linear time. And there are all kinds of cool things you can do in reading modernist literature, for example, or narrative framing. What does it mean if a film is told out of order, or there's like this fractured timeline in a post-colonial novel? I really think that aspect is important, but I don't want to lose sight of the second aspect, which is the importance of the ethical listener, or the ethical witness. This is only part of the story, part of the problem at the heart of trauma studies. Carruth says as much as early as 1995 in Trauma Explorations in Memory, the same collection where she discusses the temporal problem. Here, too, she talks about the ethical relation, picking up on the work of Holocaust scholar Dori Laub. She writes, "The traumatic re-experiencing of the event thus carries with it what Dori Laub calls the collapse of witnessing, the impossibility of knowing that first constituted it. And by carrying that impossibility of knowing out of the empirical event itself, trauma opens up and challenges us to a new kind of listening, the witnessing precisely of impossibility." We talked about that a lot, right? What does it mean to ground a theory on the impossibility, on listening or witnessing precisely of impossibility? What does that look like? The problem of time, the traumatic re-experiencing of the event, for Carruth gives way to a second problem, the impossibility of knowing, and with it, the witnessing of impossibility. How does one listen to what is impossible? Carruth asks us, a question that also informs narrative medicine, particularly the impulse of caregivers to listen to the stories and symptoms of the ill. Carruth says, quote, "The history of trauma and its inherent belatedness can only take place through the listening of an other." Again, for Carruth, the two aspects of trauma studies are inextricable. The belated understanding or processing of a traumatic event, the problem of time, is only improved in conversation with an other through listening, through the ethical relation. By our readings of Holocaust testimony, picking up with Dori Laub, then moving through the history of AIDS memoirs and cancer literature, we might be better served as scholars to consider the convergences between narrative medicine and trauma studies in two ways: the coming together of theoretical models, as well as the coming together of individuals in an ethical relation. Within these two convergences, we can consider: how do literature and theory function to bring people together? What does each owe the other? And what is ethical about the written word? Narrative medicine and trauma theory meet at the intersection of acknowledging the humanity of those who suffer, which is one way to say they are both deeply invested in the idea of an ethical relation. And here I might pause again to consider what Bessel van der Kolk adds to the conversation, which is a physician's perspective that says storytelling cannot help as much as reprogramming the body to know that it is still under attack from an outsider's thread. So maybe I'll even kind of take a step back from that to say, I'm not unaware of the fact that what Carruth is arguing, that what Sharon and Jurczyk is arguing, is provocative. Historians would say, how do you write about history? By saying it's impossible to write about history. Then we don't have history, right? And some medical experts would say, you cannot treat a sick body by listening to stories. Poetry has not changed the world, right? So within that, history on the one hand and medicine on the other hand, we have this discourse that centers the person who is suffering. And obviously we could say all of these things go together, right? You need all three. So I think I'm more interested in the idea of an ethical witness than finding new neural pathways, although there are experts to do that. And I do know that both approaches are equally important, but particularly useful for considering the importance of AIDS writing in the 1980s. Sharon's sense of narrative ethics, as reflected through Newton, quote, exposes the fundamentally moral undertaking of selecting words to represent what before the words were chosen was formless and therefore invisible and unbearable. So how do you help patients choose their words? Medical professionals are asking that, psychoanalysts are asking that, literary scholars are asking that. It's about language. For me, that is where the significance of literary writing lies. The significance of language itself becomes central to the story of AIDS or any other chronic illness. The language offered by memoirists, dramatists, and poets in the early 1980s gave American readers a way to grasp the otherwise unspeakable effects of AIDS. So in the next couple of paragraphs, I'm going to look at AIDS writing as an exemplary case of this, but I imagine that you can think of all different kinds of writing, right? Cancer narratives is a big one. Alzheimer's memoirs is another one. All kinds of illness and representations of illness fall into this conversation. And so I use Paul Monet's Borrowed Time as a perfect case of HIV/AIDS writing that helps us see the importance of witnessing. While some critics would lament Monet's use of war and moon imagery to represent his experience with HIV/AIDS, his use of intertext and self-referential humor to depict the experience of watching his lover die, it is through the very literary devices that a seemingly out-of-touch reader can find her way into this story. Rather than direct her message to physicians and other healthcare workers in arguing for a deeper sense of empathy as provided by the literary text and an ethical relationship to language, there's also Ann Jurczyk, who speaks directly to literary critics themselves. So I'm going to add one more text to this conversation. In Illness as Narrative from 2012, Jurczyk suggests that contemporary critics do not do well in interpreting illness narratives and calls on us all to do better. The goal of her book is, quote, to explore how writers and readers use narratives of illness to make meaning of the experience of living at risk, in prognosis, and in pain. She seeks to consider how narratives of illness invite reflection about the purpose and future of literature, the arts, and literary criticism. The impetus for Jurczyk's book seems to be a similar impetus for my thinking, which is understanding that in the 1980s and 90s, quote, the quantity of writing about HIV/AIDS seemed to exceed that of any previous disease. While she is primarily interested in the ways that AIDS memoirs give way to illness and disability narratives as established literary genres, I would like to add that the output of AIDS writing in particular especially is important as it demands an ethical witness. Taking her lead, then, we can think about a specific kind of writer, one who makes self-conscious demands on the reader to witness. And we can think about that as it works with specific kinds of illnesses. So we can think about all these writers about trauma. Kathy Carruth, Shoshana Fellman and Dory Laub in Testimony, Dominic LaCapra in Writing History, Writing Trauma, he's the historian, Jeffrey C. Alexander's Trauma, a Social Theory, and Kurtz's Trauma and Literature. They've all considered extensively the significance of the witness in trauma narratives of 20th and 21st centuries. Rita Sharon's narrative medicine and Ann Jurczyc's illnesses narrative use the same language as trauma studies, and they privilege an ethical relationship between speaker and listener, as indicated by such common concepts as witness, ethics, and listening, and do important work to begin to draw connections between the fields. So now I'm going to shift and just prove evidence for this, which is a conversation that Kathy Carruth has with AIDS activists Greg Bordowitz, Douglas Crimp, and Laura Pinsky. And it's an interview reprinted in Carruth's edited collection, Trauma, Explorations, and Memory. It further reveals the extent to which narrative medicine has emerged from trauma studies. The interview is entitled "The AIDS Crisis is Not Over." And it's singular in the trauma collection in the sense that it begins to redefine trauma as the effect of moving from trauma as an effect of a single historical event, and now helping us think about trauma as the effect of a social disregard for people who are ill. Laura Pinsky establishes the stakes of her work early on when she says, people who are ill often want a chance to talk about it, about going to the hospital, sitting in the doctor's waiting room, about what their symptoms are, what their bodies feel like, what medications they are taking. It is often hard to find someone who is willing to listen to this. This is in a 1995 edited collection called Trauma, Explorations, and Memory. And you open that book and you think Carruth is going to talk about Hiroshima, World War I and World War II, the Vietnam War, and she does. All of those, the Holocaust, all of those chapters are in that book. And then toward the end, you get this interview with AIDS activists who are not talking about that at all. They are talking about this social trauma, about being completely marginalized. Pinsky's description allows Carruth to recast a prior definition of trauma thus. She says it, it's like, Freud in real time discovering that his dream theory is not working and interpretation of dreams. Here it is in Carruth in her book. She's like, oh, so she wants clarity. So part of the traumatic experience itself is the relation to other people, others who are actively, aggressively, or simply don't want to listen. The trauma, in other words, is linked to a relation, or more precisely, lack of relation with another. And that failed relationship has to do with a failure to listen to what the ill have to say. And then Douglas Crimp comes in. Oh, maybe I don't have it. Apart from corporate. Okay. There it is. This is Douglas Crimp. He's saying, yes, Carruth, now you understand. Apart from the corporeal reality of the disease, we could say that if there's trauma associated with it, it's a socially produced trauma. In that sense, it's not like a catastrophe that just happens. It is, of course, itself a catastrophe, a catastrophic illness. But at the same time, the negative effects, the extremities that most of us experience are social. While not specifically referring to AIDS testimony, Carruth introduces her entire collection using this language of trauma, of address, of listening, of event, words and ideas or ideals that have been incorporated into the work of Jurczyk and Sharon as well. As Carruth explained as early as 1995, outside of the context of this interview, the history of trauma and its inherent belatedness can only take place through the listening of an other. The meaning of the trauma's address beyond itself concerns indeed not only individual isolation, but a wider historical isolation that in our time is communicated on the level of our cultures. For me, the silence and isolation surrounding the AIDS crisis in the early 80s undermines individuals with a chronic illness on multiple levels. If we think especially about the relationship between politics and representation, we must acknowledge how literature works doubly to represent. First, it uses literary language to represent the otherwise inexplicable, the effects of the disease for which those who suffer often have no words. Second, it serves to represent tens of thousands of people when their political representatives have failed them. I'm thinking of AIDS trauma as a hyphenated noun in the sense that the type of trauma these authors describe is interconnected with AIDS, and we can link that with politics because the lack of political recognition, the failures of our national politics in the 1980s, to use one example, contributed primarily for the traumatic effects of the disease. So what I'm trying to say, at least in this American context, is that if politicians fail to represent people who feel marginalized, then it's the art makers who come forward and fill the void. Their literature, their works of art, their kind of showing up is a way to bring attention to an overlooked problem. How are we doing on time? I have 10 minutes, I think. So as a literary critic, I see the ways in which the arts, exemplified by close readings of literature and film, call to light social problems that might otherwise be overlooked in such discourses as politics, the law, and journalism. I look to trauma studies to ground work in reading literatures of illness, and we can use, I'll use Monet as an exemplary case. I have one passage from him. So what would it mean to redefine trauma not simply as an event that happened too soon, but rather as an ongoing series of oversights that refuse to acknowledge or witness the humanity of those who suffer? The future of literature and literary criticism perhaps depends on our ability to showcase its relevance, and even if that awareness is 30 years too late, as it was in the case of exemplary AIDS narratives. So Thomas Keenan is a third activist who brings this discourse together. And he'll take it one step further by saying, there's a double trauma here. On the one hand, there's a cataclysmic event. We've been talking about that all morning. It produces symptoms and calls for testimony. And then it happens again when the value of the witness in the testimony is denied. And there's no one to hear the account, no one to attend or respond, not simply to the event, but to the witness as well. The second trauma takes place in the denial of testimony, in the turning away. What is so remarkable about literary texts is that they refuse that second trauma. They refuse to let the reader as witness turn away. They draw on the power of literary language to demand an ethical relationship in the place where politics, religion, and even the social contract have failed. We talked a little bit, I talked with one of you during lunch about what entails the ethical witness. And I was thinking about it in terms of human beings, right? But what if we think about literature and other forms of art as an ethical witness, as a body of work that kickstarts a conversation that might not otherwise happen in society? The testimony is an address for Keenan, which means that it's a provocation to a response. And that's what they don't want to give. That is, like bureaucrats, perhaps. They don't want to respond to the person who has called for responsibility. So maybe I'll end with a reading of Monet's Borrowed Time, in which he calls for a response, and then we can reflect on these things together. About a third of the way through Borrowed Time, which is a harrowing, very personal account of Monet's witnessing his Roger lover be diagnosed with AIDS and then die from complications. He talks about his feelings about what is going on in the world around him, keeping in mind that these are two highly privileged LA artist. Monette says, and if the government was stone deaf, the press was mute. The media are convinced in 1987 that they're doing a great job reporting the AIDS story, and there's no denying they've grasped the horror. But for 4 years, they let the bureaucracies get away with passive genocide, dismissing a no-win problem perceived as affecting only an underclass or two. It was often remarked acidly in West Hollywood that if AIDS had struck Boy Scouts first rather than gay men, or St. Louis rather than Kenosha, it would have been covered like a nuclear war. By juxtaposing Boy Scouts with gay men on the one hand, Kinshasa and St. Louis on the other hand, Monette points up how the Reagan administration valued some lives over others. They valued boys with Christian values on the one hand over men who had been described by the Christian right as being punished by AIDS for being gay. And they valued white middle-class folks over French-speaking Africans. Further, Monette engages in the language of war here. He compares living with AIDS to living in the trenches, to escalate the immediacy of the crisis. Such diction as stone deaf, mute horror, passive genocide, and nuclear war convey a sense that we are not talking simply about illness anymore, but about an illness ravaging a generation while political leaders refused to acknowledge what they were seeing and hearing. No one was bearing witness, Monette says. To be both stone deaf and mute is to be beyond silent on the subject. It is to be willfully so, given the powers to speak that the federal government otherwise possess. So maybe one more paragraph. Let's see. I'll move on to Susan Sontag now. So the authors, as exemplified by Monette, write their testimony. And for Keenan, quote, the testimony is an address. We talked about that. Susan Sontag's work in the field of illness narrative grows out of her own experience with illness also. She first talks about her experience as a cancer survivor and then applies that to the language she sees with regard to HIV/AIDS representation. What made illness as metaphor so significant is its understanding that using metaphors in everyday life, especially when referring to terminal illness, has a tangible effect on the lives of those carrying the weight of the diagnosis. Metaphors, Sontag reminds us, change the way we see things and in turn change the way we act. So I've just spent a good deal of time talking about the significance of literature in using literary language to bear witness to suffering and illness. And Sontag says sometimes that's good and sometimes that's not so good. What if we use war imagery, for example, to describe people who are suffering from cancer? She says that kind of rhetoric leads to a sense of like a war approach to the sick person, him or herself. So she's trying to get away from that. The problem with trauma studies, as we know, is we're trying to think of a language or a way of depicting something that seems impossible to represent. For Sontag, war imagery is not an effective substitute. So we've thought about a few thinkers here. We've thought about Rita Sharon. We've thought about Ann Jurczyk. We've thought about Kathy Carruth and all of their language kind of coming together around ethics. We've discussed Thomas Keenan and Laura Pinsky, who have called for an ethical witness to people suffering from AIDS in particular. We can extend that to all kinds of illnesses and other conditions. And so now I'll just end by kind of talking about how Emmanuel Levinas comes in when discussing the problem or like the difficulty of engaging with an other. When he says that when we are confronting with an other, and there are two possible responses, to speak or to kill, He understands that there is life between us, hanging in the balance of the written and spoken word. To be shocked into recognizing this difference is to gain a new appreciation for life itself, of the life that is written within these forms. You mustn't forget anything, Roth says in Patrimony. And Laub and Monet and Kushner, Sontag, Sharon, Juricic, Caruth say the same thing. At the end of the day, I wonder if it really matters if we say we are using the ideals of trauma theory when we talk about illness, or whether we are using the ideals of narrative medicine when we talk about trauma. Does it matter whether we follow the lead of Sharon, who says narrative acts declare the self, celebrate the other, mark their meeting as a mutual creation of identity, or whether we follow the lead of Caruth, who sees in psychoanalytic theory and other literary scenes a parable about what it means to listen to a voice that one cannot fully know, but to which it nevertheless bears witness. It seems like they're saying something similar. We don't have to choose. For me, it matters in the sense that trauma theory is an approach refuses mastery, once again, in the sense of history, illness, and especially the other. The witnessing it calls for is ethical in its purest sense. It is an impossible yet necessary demand. When we keep the question of the other open, as Shoshana Fellman suggests, whether the other be in the form of a person or the text, then we are driven to keep asking questions, to never give up on the confrontation we may never fully understand. So that's the argument. I'll go back to some passages and we can see what you see in them. Here are some questions I want to answer ultimately. To what extent is it possible to heal trauma through storytelling? Is that enough? Or illness for that matter? What is the role of the listener in treating trauma? Why is it considered ethical? What are other instances of socially produced trauma? I understand it in terms of HIV/AIDS recognition. We can think of others. What is the difference between trauma theory and narrative medicine? Do we want to preserve the distinction? I think the narrative medicine people in this room would probably say yes, we should preserve a distinction. We can acknowledge the differences. So let's look at a passage or two first and then reflect on some of these questions as a starting point. Is there anything that struck you going through? Let's see. I like this one, if this is okay. This is Douglas Crimp talking about illness in an edited collection on trauma. Apart from the corporeal reality of the disease, we could say that if there's trauma associated with it, it's a socially produced trauma. In that sense, it's not like a catastrophe that just happens. It is, of course, itself catastrophic, a catastrophic illness, but at the same time, the negative effects, the extremities that most of us experience as social. I'm going to talk about what a socially produced trauma is. How is that different than historical trauma or a traumatic event? Thank you.
Is it that historical trauma is a byproduct of the historical events that has happened, and socially produced trauma is a byproduct of the experiences with relative to the society, the people who, when they encounter people who have trauma, and they have certain stereotypes or prejudices against them, and how the person who is traumatized reacts to those things.
Yes, I love that. So you don't have to say it again. Should I paraphrase? And then or do you want to speak into the microphone? I loved it. Yeah, so the idea, I mean, we've been talking in the first lecture, we talked very much about historical trauma having to do with something that is produced by a byproduct of history, right? But what if we kind of put the responsibility for maintaining trauma within society at large, the relationship between people? And if we do that, if people turn away, if society turns away, then we have a socially produced trauma. And it seems like for crimp, like that is the biggest offense, right? Did I capture everything? Yes. So socially produced is about the people, right? The people in a social network or fabric that maybe could do something, but choose not to. All right. Other aspects of this corporeal reality, we could talk about that. I like the word catastrophe. Usually we talk about catastrophe when we talk about history, right? Extremities. Any thoughts on those words? Yes, I knew it. Thank you. Oh, the microphone is coming.
Uh, yeah, so about the socially produced trauma and historically produced trauma, I think the difference is that historically produced trauma is more of a generational thing,
Oh, great.
where the fear or the trauma is passed throughout these ages.
Yes.
Like you have the concept in South India, you have this concept called ajaram, where you have separate utensils for each person,
Yes.
and it is compartmentalized in different places where the other person may not touch the first person's utensils and everything. So I think it is an example of historically produced trauma, but socially produced trauma might be ongoing, something that is going on right now. Like for example, HIV/AIDS, we haven't found a cure for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think socially produced trauma is like an ongoing fear that might or may not continue. But these both of these traumas are obviously they can go on. But I think historically produced trauma might be it might be sort of say irrational
Yes.
in nature. Sometimes, most of the times, they are like irrational. So I mean, it is debatable, but like socially produced trauma might be, they both are irrational. Depending on the situation, it can be irrational and rational.
That's
Yeah.
really useful. Yeah. So if you think about history as on like a timeline, right, a chronology, and how history is transferred or related from one generation to the next, that's like top down, right? But socially produced is like all around us. It is ongoing. It is all around us. So what would it mean to kind of think about the people, the society as failing at the same time as a kind of generational failure? It's compounded in that way. I saw a hand. Yes.
Um,
Oh, sorry. This person has a microphone, and then we're gonna pass it over here. Yes. Okay.
I will pause.
Okay.
Okay. There is a question. Is it possible to heal trauma through storytelling? So I see yes, because when a person see his trauma and his experiences of trauma to some other people, somehow it is coming in that person's mind that I have shared, it means I feel some relaxation from this. And why I am saying yes, so I am working on graphic narrative.
Nice.
So in the book Mouse
Yes.
by Art Spiegelman, so he so in this book, we found that trauma passes through one generation to another generation, and through this book, we can say yes. But through this book, the Spiegelman tells his trauma to the audiences, and then and they feel some relaxation from this. So that's why I say yes, it heals. Thank you.
Yes, that's a great example. Does anybody else know Mouse, that graphic novel? You think, like, how can you tell the intergenerational effects of the Holocaust, representing like human actors in terms of cats and mice, right? But he pulls it off. It is an act of survival. It is so defamiliarizing that you begin to pay attention to the history. I would say the same thing with regard to Tim O'Brien. Uh, Fought in Vietnam and returned, and every single thing he wrote after that is about surviving Vietnam. Again, it's like how he got through the history he experienced it. He processed it through language.
And then we find the same type of story in Palestine by Joshua. So it also tells the trauma.
Yes.
And there is one book about the Iranian war, that is Palestine. In that, the writer also writes about the war going on in the war. It is a civil war that's going on in Iran, and how she suffers. So yes, these three, by this example, I say yes, the trauma is.
Yeah, that's a great example. I mean, there's so many relevant examples that can go beyond. There, can we get the okay? So that's okay. Then we'll pass to this woman in the green, and then we'll wrap up. Yes.
Okay, so about the historical induced trauma and social induced trauma, like could it be that they are both the byproducts of each other? Like
Great.
a historical induced trauma which occurred because of a social induced trauma in that time. Like a social induced trauma that was the byproduct of the historical trauma. Like for example, uh, as discrimination against races because
Yes.
of an event that happened because
Beautiful.
of something. Okay. Oh yeah. So like phobia like against Islamophobic because of the bombing and the stuff because of particular
Yes.
because of like because of 9/11 like that induced a trauma against like many people, like even the innocent people who may be of that same rebellion, because people have that trauma. Okay, I'm not able to formulate it properly. Like, can I add on to this point?
Yes.
For example, if I take the example of AIDS, so I feel people who were ostracized, it was a kind of historical thing, but just because there was a kind of war against AIDS or a gay war, something like that, that gave an impetus and it came to light. And we started recognizing that okay, like people are going through it and let's talk about it. Let's have a debate around that. So I feel that like this is something which is like we can't have fixed categories
Yes.
or we can't have like a kind of line, but it's kind of overlapping or juxtaposing sort of thing. It's dense or kind of but that is something like it was historically there just because of a kind of thing or socially social account or something. It came in the forefront and we started talking about it and it became social traumas.
Yes, I
That
mean,
next.
what both of your comments are pointing to is they're not mutually exclusive, right? Like I set it up on this easy continuum. Do we think about trauma in terms of history or socially produced traumas? And what you are saying is they are interrelated. One causes the other, or one can like repair the other, right? Like if we got away from socially produced trauma and had ethical witnesses, then that maybe that changes the historical timeline even, so we can read it back, forward and back. That's really useful. I got a little chill thinking about that. We have to have your contribution.
Yeah, talking about historical trauma and then this social traumas, I would like to add here is that so historical trauma takes place at a certain period of time.
Mm-hmm.
It happened, for example, if you talk about colonialism or like
mentioned her.
Yeah.
So if you talk about catharsis or collective trauma, and when people socially gathered, they gather together and then they discuss about these things. So like some examples, like I just don't remember this person who talked about slavery and how colonialism has a sheer impact upon the slavery in Africa, especially for Africans. So the difference between black and white, the racism, it is just still here. It's just still going on, and the situation is getting worse. Like if you go to like France or even in Germany, it's just like people do not even sit nigger to you because of they just do the discrimination and everything. And then if you talk about like Jews, they have no place to live. They are just the nomads of the world. They're just traveling here and there. They're fighting so much for the land that they were promised by the Britishers, but then what is happening is we also know right now. And then there is this novel that I worked upon. The author's name is Hedda Muller, and she also talked about. So Hedda Muller was born and brought up in Romania, and she was a part of this German tribal group. And this person, Ignacio Ceausescu, who was this communist leader, he was a dictator, and he ruled and he made an unbearable situation for the tribal community, especially who were living in Romania. So she talks about like how the impact is even till now. People cannot forget what happened because socially they gather together and experience a trauma.
Yes. I love that. If you honor a socially produced trauma reading, then there's no excuse for people to say, oh, like that happened and we weren't prepared. There's nothing we can do about it. Of course, like there are things that are happening now that society can acknowledge and, work to repair. So that kind of gets us out of the we weren't prepared. What were we supposed to do kind of mindset. All right. So I think, oh, yes, you will have the last word. Thank you.
Okay, like I would like to mention about the stories. Like the stories, there is one essay where we all produce stories. Stories, we are on a day-to-day basis. We all are producing stories. When I say I witness an event or I experience a situation, when I go back to my friend and narrate it, it's there we become the hero and we kind of we are creating stories. It's autobiographical, and in that sense every story in itself has a narrative technique. And when it comes to trauma, the listener and the reader, the listener and the person who is speaking, these stories actually create so much memories. We have that memory which is induced, and like everything is kind of interrelated when we talk about history and the social experience of trauma. In both the cases, it is interrelated, and the stories created through the generations. As she said, and there is this overlapping that comes as a byproduct of the experience that we have. So I thought I would listen.
So useful. And that gets us back to Rita Sharon, right? Who says, like, stories are more than just a collection that you read by Hemingway or Art Spiegelman. Like, every patient that a doctor or nurse sees has their own story to tell, and that is worth paying attention to as well. So I think we should end there, give you a break, and I applaud your participation. Thank you so much. And I'll see you again. When will I see you again? 3:30. Oh, okay. Get a stretch. Get some water. Thank you.